wave other Muslims based only on the color of their skin, and then use passages from their holy book to defend their actions. Let's get right into details. And it comes to the topic of black slavery. Someone who is unfamiliar with black history may assume that Arabs were never involved in the practice. But if you dig deep into history, you'll find that black slaves were owned by Arabs for years, if not millennia. In contrast to the United States, the Arab slave traffickers practiced castrating their captives before sale, preventing slave owners from breeding their captives and forcing them to continuously purchase fresh ones from the slave traders. In today's video, we will discuss the brutality of the Arab slave trade, with a particular emphasis on the trans-Saharan slave trade, in which Arab Muslims would kidnap and enslave other Muslims based only on the color of their skin, and then use passages from their holy book to defend their actions. Let's get right into details. The transatlantic slave trade, which involved American and European merchants, has garnered much of the attention and discourse surrounding slavery over the years. While this trade has been a significant part of African history, the Arab-Muslim slave trade, also referred to as the trans-Saharan trade or Eastern slave trade, is recognized as the longest slave trade, having lasted for more than 300 years, and taking millions of Africans out of their continent to work in foreign countries under the most appalling conditions. While official figures on the exact number of slaves captured from Africa in the trans-Saharan trade are contested, most scholars put the estimate at about 9 million. Others estimate that between AD 650 and 1600, an average of 5,000 Africans were shipped out by the Arabs per year, making a rough total of 7.25 million. Scholars have dubbed it a veiled genocide, attributing the tagline to the most painful and near-death experience slaves were subjected to, from the time they were captured as slaves to the time they were sold off abroad to labor in the fields of their new masters, and the horrible things they had to go through on the journey. After that, between 1600 and 1800, an additional 1.4 million Africans were shipped out by the Arabs. This was the peak of the Arabian trade in the 19th century, with 12,000 Africans shipped out annually. The total number of Africans shipped out to Arabia during the 19th century was 1.2 million. In terms of numbers, Arabia's 9.85 million is not far behind the conservative estimate of nearly 12 million African victims of the Atlantic slave trade. Some African leaders dispute this estimate, claiming that it is not up to the real number of Africans that were shipped out at that time. Instead, they propose that there were over 50 million African slaves shipped out to Arabia. Black Africans were the most recent slaves to be imported into the Arab Islamic Middle East. One of the first black Africans known to have been enslaved in the Arabian Peninsula and to have become one of the first converts to Islam was the Abyssinian named Bil Rabah, who was owned and freed by Abu Bakr, the Prophet Muhammad's father-in-law and later successor. To him, he gave his freed slave, who accepted the Prophet's teachings and was appointed muezzin, or caller to prayer, by Muhammad, soon after north. Africa was conquered by Arab Muslim armies in the late 7th century. Black Africans were traded over the Sahara and purchased by Arab merchants as slaves, a practice that persisted until the early 20th century. Arabs, however, had no reason to believe that all black people were deserving of being viewed as slaves. The only people who could be considered slaves were those who had been vanquished by Muslims. The rationale for this can be found in the Quran's statement to the Prophet Muhammad regarding the types of women with whom he could live. "We have made lawful unto thee, since war could not be waged against other Muslims, only unbelievers, kufr, may be owned. That is, those whom thy right hand possesseth of those whom Allah hath given thee as spoils of war. Therefore prisoners in combat might be owned." In this example, females, but eventually applied to both females and males, captured and kept as slaves. Islamic teachings never took into account the color of skin that rendered people enslavable unbelievers. The Quran acknowledges the diversity of humankind, saying, "We established you as peoples and clans so you may know one another," and defines the most honored as the most devout, meaning that no ethnic group is automatically favored by Allah. The Prophet Muhammad commented on this, saying, "White has no preference over black, nor black over white, except through devoutness." On another occasion, the Prophet is reported to have said, "The Arab has no virtue over the non-Arab, nor has the non-Arab over the Arab, nor has the black over the white or the black over the white except in terms of devotion to God. Surely the noblest of you in God's sight is the most devoted. Tanzania's Zanzibar archipelago served as a hub for the eastern slave trade, which was primarily centered in East and West Africa. In East Africa, the coastal region was the preferred route. An excerpt, loosely translated, from the book The Veiled Genocide by Franco-Senegalese author and anthropologist Tidiane Ndiaye, read, "The Arabs raided sub-Saharan Africa for 13 centuries without interruption. Most of the millions of men they deported have disappeared as a result of inhumane treatment. This painful page in the history of black people has not been completely turned." A group of enterprising Arab merchants and middlemen gathered in Zanzibar in search of raw materials, such as ivory and cloves, and then purchased black slaves to use both as laborers on their plantations abroad and as a means of transporting the raw materials. Slaves from as far away as Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia were obtained at the Zanzibar market and shipped via the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf or Arabian Peninsula, where they were employed in Oman, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. Notwithstanding Islamic legal beliefs, African Muslims were never taken captive. In contrast, the trans-Saharan caravan targeted the East African region straddling the Niger Valley and traveled as far as the Gulf of Guinea along trans-Saharan roads to slave markets in the Maghreb and the Nile Basin. The journey, which could take up to 3 months, was fraught with hardship, with an estimated 50% of all slaves involved in this trade dying in transit from diseases, starvation, and thirst. The demand for female slaves was so great that the merchants would double the price of captured women, with a 3-to-1 ratio of captured women to men. While European merchants were interested in strongly built young men as laborers in their farms, Arab merchants were more focused on concubinage, capturing women and girls who were turned into sex slaves while living in harems. Male slaves were employed as field workers or guards at the harems. The men and boys were brutally castrated and transformed into eunuchs, most of whom would die in the process, to ensure that they never procreated if they became amorous with other female slaves. According to Liberty Mukomo, a lecturer at the University of Nairobi Institute of Diplomacy and International Studies, the practice of castration on black male slaves in the most inhumane manner altered an entire generation as these men could not reproduce. The Arab masters sired children with the black female slaves. This devastation by the men saw those who survived committing suicide. This development explains the modern black Arabs who are still trapped by history. British missionary, adventurer, and explorer David Livingstone wrote in 1870, and this is what he had to say, in less time than I take to discuss it. These poor creatures, 84, made their way into the village where we were staying. The majority of them were boys and girls between the ages of 7 and 14 or 15, with a small number of older ladies, aged 20 to 22, and teenagers, aged 18 to 19. I doubt I have ever seen a situation more horrifying than this one with these men, women, and kids. Saying that they are malnourished wouldn't begin to convey the suffering that people can experience in certain situations. Each of them had its neck encased in a massive, 5 or 6 foot long fork stick that weighed between 30 and 40 pounds, tied where the tree extended out at the end of it. Little children were fastened with thorns to their mothers, while the women were bound with thorn sticks. As we proceeded along the route that these slaves had taken, I was shown a location in the underbrush where, the day before, a poor woman, unable to keep up with the march and probably a hindrance to it, had been chopped down with one of these slave drivers' axes. As we continued, we were shown a location where a newborn lay. Its mother had been unable to care for it due to weakness and exhaustion, so the slave traders had taken the young child by the feet, smashed its head against a tree, and thrown it in there. This is the extent of the cruelty and brutality the Arabs inflicted upon the black Africans. While the United States officially outlawed the African slave trade in 1865 in Europe, one of the major participants in the trade outlawed slavery hundreds of years earlier. Most Arab nations carried on with the trade until the late 20th century, when slavery was officially outlawed in Malawi in 2007, and there were rumors that some Arab nations were still involved, albeit covertly. The degree and intensity with which it altered the entire social, reproductive, and economic life of black people made it more brutal and painful than the transatlantic one, Liberty stated. even as the rest of the world realized the harm slavery did to an entire continent and made a declaration to abolish it. The Arabs protested it, and it took a lot of international trade and revolt by the slaves for them to end it. The trans-Saharan slave trade was run and controlled by Arabs. However, Berbers also played a significant role. 4 main routes were identified by Professor Ibrahima Baba Kake as the routes of slavery from East to West Africa, from the Maghreb to the Sudan, from Tripolitania to Central Sudan, and from Egypt to the Middle East. Caravan trails were established in the 9th century and passed beyond the Saharan oasis. The journey was arduous and uncomfortable. Slaves were transported in long convoys beginning in the Roman era. Systems of servitude and slavery were once commonplace in parts of Africa, as they were in much of the rest of the ancient and medieval world. Many of the pre-existing local African slave systems began supplying captives for slave markets outside of Africa when the Trans-Saharan, Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and Atlantic slave trades began, which started in the 16th century. Slavery in contemporary Africa is still practiced despite having been abolished. In conclusion, as a part of the repercussions of the slave trade, many of our sons and daughters have disappeared from view, making this an exceptional event in African history that is thankfully chronicled. Many well-meaning people may feel ashamed that their fight against racism and black slavery hasn't completely ended these horrible practices, but they should take comfort in the fact that their calls for justice have had a global impact and motivated black minorities and their allies to demand more systemic change and increased awareness of these issues in the Arab world and elsewhere. The world must come to realize that Black Lives Matters. If you enjoy this video and would like to see more educational content, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you can be notified when we upload new videos. Thank you for watching. See you in our next video.